picture, of course, of the tabernacle of David. Of course, very different to... there is a wonderful difference in the denominations, I think.
Yes, it's a total different feel, as described that the different tribes, and if you do a study of the tribes, you see they all had different characteristics and different tasks to do. Right. And that's a really important understanding of the different denominations. We're not separated, but we have different characteristics, different tasks that the Lord gives us to do. And if we, in fact, at the end of the prayer day yesterday, they were praying for the harvest to come in. And I had the picture because Laurie's from a wheat farm. And at harvest time...
Laurie's your husband.
Yes, Laurie's my husband, yes. At harvest time, often the tractors would break down or the equipment would break down. And so I was saying, Lord, minister to those that are the equivalent of to keep the equipment going. And then you need the trucks to carry the grain to the... There's so many different tasks and there's long hours, and cooks to feed the farmers. So many different tasks. And Lord, bring in all the different things that are needed, that everyone would recognise their part, that each part's different. But we need to... It's not a competition. To bring in the harvest, you've got different people doing different tasks. And when Jesus said, pray the Lord of the harvest for the harvesters to come in, we are in a season of harvest. And so it's a time to really understand where we're all at. So, but anyway, that's right off script, and that's good conversation.
Good conversation. Thank you.
And very powerful understanding we all need. So welcome to the Tabernacle of David today, and I pray that the blessings of the Lord are fresh and special for everyone today. This is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad in it. Let's go on giving our thanks to God, for He is so good. His constant tender love lasts forever. Amen. The story of Esther is inspirational with so many lessons for us today. It speaks of God's deliverance from a wicked plot to destroy the Jewish people. And yesterday in Israel was Purim, which is the celebration of Esther. And of course we know Mordecai refused to bow to wickedness. And what a lesson for us today, not to bow to wickedness. And Esther called 3 days of prayer and fasting before her courageous act. And the Lord is calling his people more and more to days of prayer and fasting, to seek the Lord. I spoke last week about Jehoshaphat, who did the same, surrounded by enemies, and called a day of prayer and fasting. And so we just were talking about that we were doing yesterday right across Australia. And in that moment, it took courage as well as prayer and trust in God for Mordecai and Esther, for Esther to go before the king to present her request and to actually expose Haman. But in that moment, God's favour and God's hand turned it around, so that what was meant for evil, God turned around. And this is such a lesson for us, with whether it's King Jehoshaphat, whether it was Mordecai and Esther, or even King David. He prayed, he said, Lord, they've set a trap for me, and frantic fear has overwhelmed me. But look, the very trap they set for me has sprung shut upon themselves instead of me. Arise, my soul, and sing his praises. So in the midst of our fears, whether it's traps being laid or confusion of what's going on in the earth at the moment, that song of Steve Grace, keep our eyes upon the Lord. And the maker of heaven and earth, the God of the miraculous, turns things around. So that's a real word of encouragement to us today. I just want to quickly touch on Genesis 12. A promise the Lord gave to Abraham. He said, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. All the families of the earth shall be blessed through you. So we know that God blesses those who bless Israel and curses those who curse them. And I know that Australia has blessed Israel thus far, and we have reaped a real blessing many times in our nation. And we need to continue to pray for them and stand with them. And it says in Scripture that Moab and Ammon were cursed by God, one of the reasons because they did not help Israel through the wilderness, and they hired Balaam to curse her. So today, after the first song, I'm going to be talking with Barbara Miller. And Barbara is a white woman, and her husband Norman is an indigenous but they pastor the Tabernacle of David in Cairns. And the story starts whereby Australia could have been cursed, but it ends with us positioning ourselves to be blessed. Most nations in the earth, including Australia, at the time the Nazis were rising in Germany, nations chose to not give the Jews a place of refuge, and many of them died as a consequence. So in this story today, you're going to hear about an indigenous man not far from here, near Echuca, who actually stood to say this is not okay. And so it's a story that ends with great blessing. But before we do that, as we think about that, Karen Davis sings a beautiful song, Israel, My Beloved. That's all right. Okay. Well, my guest today is Barbara Miller from Cairns, and Barbara and her husband Norman are the pastors of the Tabernacle of David in Cairns. Barbara is a pastor, a psychologist, mediator and teacher. She's also a prolific author of 10 books, and they include subjects of Australian history, indigenous issues and the Holocaust. So welcome, Barbara. It's a privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you, Ruth. It's wonderful to join you on the interview. Thanks for the opportunity.
Pleasure. So, Barbara, you and I have known each other since 2004, but our audience may not know you, although together we hosted a conference here in Bendigo in 2007. So for those that don't know you, who is Barbara Miller? And tell us a bit about yourself and Norman.
Well, as well as being pastors of the Tabernacle of David in Cairns, which we originally pioneered the church in Cairns in 1996, although it has changed names since then, we have hosted about 10 conferences on the theme of Psalm 24/7, opening the gates to the King of Glory and closing the gates to things that aren't of the Lord, and the Jeremiah 1:10 mandate. And I've written Christian journals as well on prayer and Bible study, and privileged recently to do a chapter in the Canberra Declaration book because Norman, who's an Aboriginal pastor and artist, and I opened the door for the Canberra Declaration at one of our Parliament House Canberra conferences, and the following year we opened the door for the National Day of Prayer and Fasting. So,
oh wow,
yes, and so I'm busy writing 2 books at the moment.
Wow, very busy lady, and involved in so many things. So that's fantastic. So in your writings, Barbara, I mentioned about 10 books, but 3 of them about an Aboriginal man named William Cooper. Now, you describe him in your first book as gentle warrior, and sitting here in Bendigo, it's not very far from where he was. What can you tell us about William Cooper and where he grew up?
Well, he was born near Echuca on the Murray River area, New South Wales side of the border, but he spent a lot of his time in Victoria as well. His mother, Kitty, she was a tribal woman, and she actually saw the first white explorers go into Yorta Yorta territory. Rumbalara Cooperative and other Aboriginal organisations today around the Shepparton area have a lot of the Yorta Yorta people, quite famous tribe of Aboriginal leaders.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, that's about an hour away from Bendigo, where we're sitting, so very near to here. So, with William Cooper, what were the Christian influences in his life?
Well, basically, Daniel and Janet Matthews, who were quite anti-slavery, they established a mission at Maloga. And so William and some of his brothers and sisters spent time on the mission, and he became a Christian there. And Daniel Matthews influenced the men there to put in petitions for land and to be self-sufficient as possible. As a child, William Cooper worked for a parliamentarian, and as an adult he was a union organiser. So there were a number of influences on his life.
Oh, good. So in your book you talk about his being a relative of Pastor Sir Doug Nicholls, who's very well known in the Parliament, but also I grew up in the Church of Christ, so I knew of him from there. So what was that relationship, and how important was that relationship to him too?
Well, I think it was a very important relationship. Pastor Sir Doug Nicholls was actually the nephew of William Cooper, and William Cooper really mentored him. In fact, he would wait for him outside football matches and say, "Come on, Doug, it's time you started warbling your tongue for Aboriginal people." And so he stayed on his case, and as we know, that was a very successful relationship, as Doug assisted William Cooper. William set up the Aboriginal Advancement League in Melbourne after he moved to Melbourne in the 1930s, and Doug became a part of that. And also together they were involved in the famous Day of Mourning in Sydney, along with Sydney leaders of the 150th anniversary of white settlement.
So just briefly, what was life like for William Cooper and his family on the mission? Just over the border there?
Yeah, look, it was very distressing for him in many ways. Once Maloga was closed because the New South Wales government had some issues with Daniel Matthews encouraging the men to put in petitions for land, and so they closed Maloga and they set up Cumragunja. And if you go to Cumragunja today, you will see in the cemetery, it's very, very moving, the graves of many famous Aboriginal leaders who were Yorta Yorta people. But there was very, very harsh management by the government there. And so William Cooper led a strike of the people, and they moved from the from the New South Wales side over to the Victorian side of the border to escape that very harsh management. But people were dying around him.
Yeah. So then he moved, so you said Shepparton, and then later on he was in Footscray as well.
Well, as far as I know, he didn't actually live in Shepparton, but a lot of his descendants do today.
Okay, yes, yep. So, so then he was in the Melbourne area itself, basically in the rest of the story that we're going to talk about today.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So I'm talking with Barbara Miller from the Tabernacle of David in Cairns, and does a lot of work, and a prolific author, and we'll be talking further with Barbara. It's a very interesting story of William Cooper. I'm speaking today with Barbara Miller, who's from Cairns, and we've been chatting to Barbara about a book, or 3 books she's written about William Cooper. And right now we're going to turn our attention to the Evian Conference and the White Australia Policy, and we'll connect the dots on that in a moment. But in the 1930s in Germany, there was the rise of Hitler and eventually the Holocaust. In March 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, and 200,000 Jews became stateless. A few months later, the Evian Conference was held in France about the Jewish refugees. Barbara, in 2004, you held a conference in the Parliament of Australia, and I heard you speak about this situation. And to be honest, I was shocked because it was the first time I'd ever heard about it. And I'm sure there's plenty of others out there that are listening today that haven't heard this as well. So can you tell us about the Evian Conference and what was Australia's position toward the Jewish refugees at the Evian Conference?
Okay, the Evian Conference in France in 1938, the nations were gathered together to deal with the Jewish refugee problem under the rise of Nazism. Unfortunately, most of the nations closed their door, including Australia, although we did take a trickle. But Mr. T.W. White, who was representing Australia, said, "We do not have a racial problem and we are not desirous of importing one." So basically what this meant was that, I'm just going to adjust that. Yeah, sorry. So basically what this meant was that Jewish people died as a result of not being able to get refuge in these nations. And so it was really something that affected Norman and I greatly. In 1998, we went to Yad Vashem and we actually saw a plaque there that said what Mr. T.W. White had. It was there for all to see. And later years, when I went there again, I said to a guide, considering that all the nations closed the doors, why have you singled out Australia's response? And so she said, well, all the other nations cited economic reasons, but Australia was honest to cite racial reasons. So anti-Semitism was quite rife in the nations around the world, affecting that particular decision.
And of course, we know from that, I, as you were talking, I think vividly of that ship that was turned back in America that was eventually, I think, torpedoed, and just so many thousands of millions died because countries would not take
Louisa,
yes. That countries would not take them in, and so they died. And it was just a horrendous thing. And to know that Australia added to that is rather confronting for us. I certainly found that when you shared that. In your book, you spoke about the White Australia policy that really fed that. I mean, you said it goes back to the 1850s with the Chinese miners. Now, of course, in Bendigo, the Chinese miners is a big story here. And interestingly, after that conference, when I heard you speak about this, the Lord asked us to hold a conference with David Swan. And I didn't know, but the Lord then said, as we prepared for that, you're to apologise to the Chinese, and because it was a Chinese church, for the tax that Victoria put on the Chinese, not on others, for coming in, and really imposed it. So if that's the root, how does that White Australia policy affect Australia's immigration policies?
Well, in 1901, everything came to a head with the Federation of the Nation. And one of the reasons for the states getting together and federating was their concern about immigration. And they wanted particularly to keep the Chinese out, who'd been here on the goldfields, as you say, and also the Kanakas, who had been blackbirded from Melanesian nations to work on the sugarcane farms in Queensland. And so this was very much to develop a White Australia to keep non-Europeans out, and particularly non-British. And it was amazingly right up until 1996 that we had this policy. And between 1966 and 1978, successive governments finally dismantled that policy. So it is that recent, and it was basically the Vietnamese refugees coming here after the Vietnam War.
That changed that.
That's what changed things.
Yeah. And I was very aware of that because there was a lot of Vietnamese coming to the town I was living in at that time in Melbourne.
And, you know, we have the Palmer River goldfields here, about 200 k's northwest of Cairns. And so basically, you know, it led to Norman and I also repenting to Chinese at conferences that we've had here.
Yes, and that's an ongoing discussion, isn't it? Because there's been a lot of work done in that area and it's an ongoing thing. So I believe you and Norman personally apologised to Jews in Australia and at Yad Vashem, which for those that don't know is the Holocaust Museum in Israel. Can you just tell us about when those occasions?
Okay, so look, it's a little harder for me now because we've got very heavy rain here.
Oh, that's all right. I can't hear it.
But basically, in terms of our apologies, Norman and I, to Jewish people, once we saw that plaque in Yad Vashem, it was really our desire to have a plaque sitting beside it to note Australia's apology.
Yeah.
But we did what we could at the time. We said sorry to Jews in Cairns. We went to Sydney. We met with the Israel Consul General there, Effie Ben Netanyahu. We met with Wheatso and the Sydney Jewish Museum and said sorry. Now, also to Jeremy Jones of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Now, he took a photo of us and put that in the Jewish News, and someone from Sydney sent it to us. And in that, we actually found that the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne was commemorating what William Cooper had done with regard to Kristallnacht. We thought, wow, you know, we had been promoting the story of William Cooper and his work for the uplift, as he called it, of Aboriginal people, and we didn't know that he had done that with regard to Jewish people. So this was increased our interest in the William Cooper story.
Mm.
Yeah.
So how was the response that you found when you made that apology to the Jewish people, first of all in Australia and then in Israel?
We found they were very touched by it. Mm-hmm. And later on in Israel, in December 2003, we went on a tour to Israel with Jill Curry. Yeah. And we told her it was our desire to repent at Yad Vashem. And so in January the 5th, we met with Solly Kaplinsky as a team, and Norman and I led that repentance. And he is in charge, or at that time was in charge of the English desk and international relations. He was very, very touched. And Norman also gave him a painting that he had done on Beersheba on the Australian Light Horse as well. And when we went in December 2010, we also gave a certificate of apology to the person who replaced Solly, which was Shaya Ben Yehuda, because we wanted to have some physical evidence of it. And later we actually gave a plaque to him as well, because we were still praying at that stage that a plaque would go alongside Australia's response. We don't want to wipe out Australia's response, but we want to let people know that things have changed.
Yeah, I was going to say, as you're talking, I'm just thinking of the change in Israel as this work of reconciliation has been taking place. And even in Australia, I know I've noticed a significant difference. Have you also noticed a difference in relationship between?
Oh, look, it's absolutely amazing. And well, Yad Vashem is one example that it actually encourages Christian friends of Yad Vashem.
Yeah.
But the Israel government in particular is very favourable toward Christians coming to Israel for conferences. Okay, we know that the finance is good from Christian tourism, but also they know that these days Christians are their friends. Unfortunately, with the Holocaust, Germany was a nominally Christian nation, and so, you know, Christians bear a lot of responsibility for the Holocaust. And today, Israel has seen that change.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really significant. So you and Norman campaigned for 10 years for Australia to apologise then for their treatment of Jewish refugees at the Evian conference. Why was that, and were you successful?
Okay, we just felt that it was just such a great need to really heal the hurts of the Holocaust. We've done a lot of other things in relation to that, but this was one of the things that we worked on. Hilary Moroney worked on it as well, and some others. And basically, when we found out through the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Peter Wertheim actually had taken the position from Jeremy, and we were leading a tour in Israel, around Israel, to the battle sites and the sites of significance to Christians in 2010. We were there at October 31 for the Beersheba anniversary. While we were there on a bus travelling around Israel, I got a text from Peter Wertheim, and he's let me know that there was this group, a large group of bipartisan parliamentarians from Australia who were going to be in Israel in December around the time of William Cooper and its anniversary, and that he would be honoured by Yad Vashem with this chair of resistance to the Holocaust named after him. So we speedily made our way, when we got the group back to Australia, and speedily made our way back to Israel to be there at Yad Vashem for that event, because we believed it was historically very significant.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why it's so significant is, you know, Genesis tells us, Genesis 12 tells us that the nations that bless Israel will be blessed, and William Cooper has brought a blessing upon our nation that of immense spiritual significance. And for him, as an Aboriginal Christian who did not have citizenship rights in his own country, who was living in poverty, who would stay up and at lamplight without electricity at night and write letters to politicians. You know, this was just such a blessing on our nation. We had to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just how amazing is that? So we're going to have a song, and then we're going to continue our discussion with Barbara, especially now about the link between the Holocaust and William Cooper's story. I'm with Barbara Miller today, and we're discussing her books about William Cooper and especially his response to the Holocaust. So in 1938, Nazi Germany took over Austria, then the Evian Conference was held, and then a worse event took place later that year, and it was a real turning point against the Jewish people. German theologian Bonhoeffer observed this period. He said the cross in Germany has been eclipsed by the swastika, and he called on the church to speak for the voiceless and defend the weak and the fatherless. And I really felt that what he said, he was calling that for the German church, but that really sums up what William Cooper did. And so the infamous event was in November of 1938, Kristallnacht. So Barbara, what was Kristallnacht, and how did William Cooper respond to it?
Yes, so Kristallnacht means the night of the broken glass. It was on November 9, 1938. And basically, Nazi stormtroopers ravaged through Germany, Austria and Sudetenland, and they killed 91 Jews. They burnt and broke the glass in 900 synagogues, 7,000 businesses, also destroyed some homes, and 30,000 Jewish people were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. So it was really the spark that ignited the Holocaust. Yeah. And so that's why one of my books is called Shattered Lives, Broken Dreams. And it explains what William Cooper and the Aborigines League did and what's been done since then to progress that story.
So it's interesting, the Aryan Conference was in France, and here in Australia is William Cooper. And as we said before, he's been honoured at Yad Vashem. So how do all these stories come together? What was it that William Cooper did specifically that he was honoured?
Well, basically, there was some response in the Australian media, but very little done by world governments. The President of the US took until the 15th of November to criticise the event. So William Cooper met with the Australian Aborigines League in Melbourne, and they passed a motion against the cruel persecution of Jewish people by Germany. And they decided to have a march or a walk, whatever you prefer to call it, from his home in Footscray to the German consulate in Melbourne. That happened on December the 6th, 1938. And when they got there, and I write about, the amazing thing that actually happened, that you've got this group of Aboriginal people plus a few white supporters with no rights in Australia taking up the rights of the Jewish people, because most of them were Yorta Yorta people, most of them were Christians, and they had been brought up on Negro spirituals at Maloga in particular, about the story of the Jewish people coming out of slavery in Egypt into the promised land. And so they had a very strong connection with the Jewish people. The German consul would not give them admittance or receive the letter of protest. So that's what William Cooper is honoured for, because it's one of the few private protests worldwide against Kristallnacht. Much of the world stood silent.
Yeah, and that would have taken a lot of courage, as you say. He really related to what the Jewish people were going through. It's interesting you mentioned the Negro spirituals, because I'm actually reading Bonhoeffer's book at the moment, and he was so touched by the Negro spirituals when he went to America, and that stirred him to stand with the Jewish people. But that's another whole story. So in 2012, you did a reenactment of Cooper's protest walk when you launched your book about him. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I launched my book on the 6th of December 2012, first of all at Shepparton at Rumballara Cooperative, to do it on country first.
Yes.
And on December the 6th, what I did was I had contacted the German consulate and said we would like to do a reenactment of William Cooper's walk. Michael Pearce was the honorary consul. He was favourable, got in touch with the German embassy in Canberra, got it cleared very quickly. And I said to Michael, look, we'd like to be at the actual site where the consulate was in 1938. And he said, well, it's actually a law firm at the moment, and I know them, so I can organise their approval. So that was wonderful. So Abe Schwartz, who has been a long-time Jewish supporter and promoter of the William Cooper story, he organised the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, where I launched the book later that night to take part. And we had Jews, Christians, Aborigines, Holocaust survivors, all on this reenactment walk. And it was an amazing time. And when we got there, Uncle Boydie, William Cooper's grandson, gave a copy of the letter that his grandfather, William Cooper, intended to give to the German consulate, gave it to Michael Pearce. Now, what really surprised us was that Michael Pearce apologised for what Germany did in the Holocaust to Jewish people. And so we had all these Holocaust survivors there and
Oh,
children of
wow.
survivors, and the tears flowed, and it was
Yeah.
just such a special occasion. It was just awesome. Very, very, people were very, very touched. It was a very, very special healing time. And, Norman and I have a ministry of reconciliation, and so this just fitted right into our ministry and calling as well.
That is so powerful, isn't it? Because, I mean, you can't orchestrate things like
No.
that. Only God can really set that up, can't he? And
Absolutely.
And as you say, the healing that brings is probably immeasurable. The depth that goes to in those what seem to be little small acts, but yet they're so significant, and it's just extraordinary. And praise God for that, for what you've done in that regard. So I understand there's been ongoing involvement with William Cooper's grandson, Uncle Boydie, in promoting the legacy of William Cooper. How's that looked?
Yes, look, before we go to that, can we have a look a little bit more at the government-to-government apology regarding Evian, because with it was just amazing how these two things came together, because they're both about Jewish lives, basically, when you think about it. But we had been lobbying, as I said, for 10 years about this issue of Evian. Amazing, we had a convergence of the Evian and the Kristallnacht protest of William Cooper and the Australian Aborigines League on December the 12th at Yad Vashem in Israel. Norman and I were privileged to be there for it. And at a dinner, Kevin Rudd, who was leading, I think it was 17 MPs, he was foreign minister at the time, and he not only gave this wonderful speech in honour of William Cooper as he was received the chair of resistance to the Holocaust named after him, but also he did a very powerful repentance with regard to Evian. And it was amazing, and it was just so good. We had the culmination of that 10 years. And the next day, Kevin Rudd was at the King David Hotel, a meeting with Israeli government, and he made the apology again there. Wow. So that was so special. Yeah. And interestingly enough, there's two more little bits to that story. Senator Guy Barnett, who we happened to be at the table with at the dinner at Yad Vashem, when we got back to Australia, he, in the Senate, in 2011, he made an apology regarding Evian. That's noted in Hansard. Wow. And also, after the visit of the Christian Allies caucus in 2018, MP Stuart Robert made a similar apology, and a motion of agreement was passed in Parliament. And this happened to be not only the anniversary, I believe the 70th anniversary of the formation of the modern state of Israel, but also the in July, the 80th anniversary of Evian as well. Wow. So, I really believe that what we set out to do with the help of the Lord has been achieved.
It's so exciting, isn't it, when you put all the dots together, the way God brings these things line upon line, event upon event, and just releases the forgiveness and the cleansing. It's not just an individual thing, but for nations.
Absolutely, and that's been a large part of our focus, has been reconciliation between nations as well. So with regard to Uncle Boydie, there's a bit of poetic justice here, because Abe Schwartz and David Jack and myself formed a team around Uncle Boydie, William Cooper's grandson, and and others joined from time to time, came and went over the years. And basically, Uncle Boydie believed there were two unfinished pieces of business from William Cooper. One is the 1930s petition for Aboriginal rights to the King of England, and the Australian government did not deliver that. The other was what we just talked about, the replica of the motion regarding Kristallnacht. So in May, Reconciliation Week 2014, a culmination of a lot of work, Uncle Boydie and Abe and David and I got to meet Peter Cosgrove in Canberra, the Governor-General at the time, and Uncle Boydie gave him a replica of the original 1930s petition, which he later passed on to the Queen. And so then in 2017, there was a visit by Uncle Boydie and David and others to Israel, England, Belgium and Germany. And we saw Uncle Boydie in Israel. You were there too, Ruth, for the 100th anniversary of their Sheva. Uncle Boydie laid a wreath and Norman and I laid a wreath.
Yes.
But, you know, what was so significant for Uncle Boydie, as well as visiting England, seeing his nephew Dan Cooper, William Cooper's son's grave in Belgium, where he died in fighting in World War I. And in Germany, he actually got to give a copy to the German government of the letter of protest that his grandfather tried to give in 1938. He gave it to the German government. And in last year, on December 6, 2020, for the anniversary of William Cooper and the League's Walk, the German government by Zoom apologised in a meeting for not receiving that in 1938. So all that Uncle Boydie wanted to achieve to promote the legacy and finish the business of his grandfather, William Cooper, has been done. And amazingly, the current Queen of England, she is the granddaughter of King George, who Uncle Boydie, as the grandson of William Cooper, would have received the petition. So it's amazing.
It's a full circle.
Full circle. It's
yeah. Oh, awesome. That's just so exciting. I'm so sorry our time is gone, but it's like, what a joy to talk to you and for these stories to be pulled out and to talked about. And I just encourage listeners to get some of Barbara's books. There's, as I say, 3 about William Cooper, and you can go to her website, barbaramillerbooks.com, barbaramillerbooks.com, and you can get the books and learn more for it. Thank you, Barbara, so much for your time today. It's just been a real joy, and thank you for your wonderful work that you and Norman have done in this reconciliation towards the Jewish people and with the Aboriginal people. It's a story that's not told far and wide enough, and so it's a great joy to have you with us today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruth.